I'm Steve Williams on AM 560, The Answer.
Get the latest weather, traffic, and news updates online at 560theanswer.com. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Interesting to see what big city mayors are doing to draw people's attention away from their sanctuary designations and thus the influx of illegal immigrants and the expense of illegal immigrants, the provision of other people's money to illegal immigrants. It's roiled some indigenous residences of places like New York and Chicago. Yeah. So what do the mayors of New York and Chicago do? Well, BLM Brandon this week rolls out his reparations task force, and he touts his administration as the blackest in Chicago history.
And yesterday they announced the big unveiling of the chief equity officer. It was very exciting. Cheryl Burton was all excited, so honored to have her on set yesterday. It was kind of disturbing.
And New York City Mayor Eric Adams, taking a page out of BLM Brandon's book, talking about brown and black people, magical. The composition of the administration is more important than the competency of it.
And not only that, what do? First woman of color to be the commissioner. First Spanish speaking to be the commissioner in the police department. First Trinidadian to be a deputy mayor. First Dominican to be a deputy mayor. First African American to be the first deputy mayor. Second African American to be the chief of staff. Why? The first one was by David Dinkins. When you look at our administration, first Indian American to be a deputy mayor, first Filipino American to be a deputy mayor, first Korean American to head small business services. You look at our administration and you will see for yourself, we got all of this chocolate running the city. And you're trying to figure out why they hating on me? Listen, folks, I came into office, we were spending pennies in women and black-owned businesses. We're now spending billions of dollars.
Don't worry, there's plenty of money for you, too. That's the... We got some spoils of war for you, too, so don't complain too loud. That's why they're hating on Eric Adams. Who's the they? Oh, honkies? Well, what about the chocolates that are hating on Eric Adams or on Brandon Johnson? Well, we just ignore that. We tell the minority groups that, hey, you don't want to throw in with those hateful honkies that are hating on Eric Adams or hating on Brandon Johnson because they both are elevating minorities and putting together the most minority-centric administrations in the history of their respective cities. It's great boogeyman politics. Great boogeyman politics. Will it continue to work? To help us with that question, we're pleased to be joined, as always, by Bob Woodson, founder and president of the Woodson Center, also founder of 1776 Unites, author of Lessons from the Least of These, the Woodson Principles. Bob, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Always a pleasure. Always.
So what's your reaction to Brandon Johnson and Eric Adams this week?
I mean, it's the same patronizing, demeaning assumption that if you put black faces in high places, that it becomes a substitute for competent administration. But low-income people who are suffering in these communities, they know the difference between rhetoric and action. And that's why when you look at survey after survey, they are more concerned about bread and butter issues. We've done surveys of our groups, 3,000 of them all over the country, as well as over the last 10 years, there have been surveys asking low-income blacks, what is the most important issue to you? Race never comes up one time, and yet Eric Adams and others will continue to project this notion that somehow that's all blacks are concerned about. they know when they showed up in Boston at that recreation center that the low-income black community has been trying to get the city to renovate for decades, but they renovated it and moved migrants into it, and so black kids couldn't use it. Mm-hmm. And so all of that rhetoric about, hey, we got black faces in high places means nothing to people who are worried about their children being murdered on the streets in Chicago. More blacks are killed by other blacks in 1 year than were killed in 50 years of the Ku Klux Klan. And so you go into these communities that I walk with and ask them if what he's talking about has any relevance at all to improving conditions in their community. They will tell you no. And this is why it's important, though, for Republicans to go beyond the rhetoric and reach into those communities and connect with the leaders in that community and work with them, fund them, and support them so that they can begin to apply remedies to the problem, and then you will see a sea change. But the only way you're going to combat this rhetoric isn't going to be by counter-rhetoric on the other complaining about what they're doing. We must invest in people like Corey Brooks and others who are making a difference on the ground in these communities. That's the ground game.
Speaking of Chicago, I mean, Mayor Johnson yesterday for Juneteenth talked about reparations, how the money, if they give it to the black families, they'll invest that in their communities.
Reparations will unlock the doors for prosperity to fully flow through the neighborhoods that have been disinvested in for decades.
What are your thoughts on reparations?
It is fool's gold. First of all, the reason that we're in this mess now, in the 60s, we separated work from income. Anytime you separate work from income, it has the effect of promoting decline in these communities. Whether you look at the people who won the lottery, look at just what happened to their lives, and welfare. How over welfare policies destroyed the black family by separating work from income. That was their deliberate strategy. So reparations is a continuation and an extension of what failed in the past. The problem isn't money that people have, it's the attitude and what. In Chicago, in our studies, in Chicago in 1919, in the Brownsville section, there was 731 black-owned businesses. There was $100 million in real estate assets at a time when blacks did not have access to capital. Why don't we go back to those times that when blacks were prospering in the midst of oppressive segregation to find out what they did to promote flourishing in the face of oppression? Rather than turning to the government to do it, we need to turn to our own past to see what we achieved in the past that we can apply to the present.
You point to this opportunity that exists now because of what's happening in these urban centers, and particularly among young black voters. It's showing up in some of the polling in the presidential race, too, which is sort of an indicator that there is opportunity present, certainly to make inroads. And in your piece in the Wall Street Journal, which is entitled How Black Voters Become Swing Voters, you offer a couple of examples, real-world examples, that could be replicated in a 2024 context of how to take advantage of more blacks becoming swing voters. Can you elaborate on those examples a bit?
Yeah, what Dick Riordan did in the 90s, he was the first Republican mayor in 31 years, I think, and because he came in 2 years before he declared and worked with low-income leaders to ask them what is it that they want and they need. He recruited some of his friends and built a state-of-the-art learning center in South Central and also in the low-income areas of East L.A. And as a consequence of addressing the concrete needs of low-income people and building institutions and investing in them, when he declared for the office, he was the first one to get elected because grassroots people, low-income people, are politically agnostic. They are radical. They share my political philosophy, which is radical pragmatism. And so he invested, and as a consequence, when he ran for re-election, he won by 60% of every demographic. Steve Goldsmith did the same thing in Indianapolis a couple years later. We worked for 6 years with Steve. Steve hired 4 people in his office with private funding, and their sole responsibility was to make government more responsive to low-income groups. He privatized public services, contracted with local churches to manage the public parks, and they hired local teenagers, and they cleaned the parks and kept them safe because there was a sense of ownership. He brought together about 50 small business owners in high-crime areas and formed an informal kind of chamber of commerce, and then he encouraged the mall owners to invest in them, and the city contracted. There was just a combination of investments into these communities, and as a consequence, some of the most rundown, crime-ridden neighborhoods became the most invested and the most prosperous as a consequence, and Steve was rewarded by being reelected. And so these are just 2 examples of when you invest charitably, you can harvest politically, but you don't harvest and plant in the same year. But Republicans need to wake up and stop trying to offer opposition rhetoric to what the left is doing and outperform them by going into these communities and identifying local leaders, listen to them, and encourage your friends who are writing $1 million checks to political parties. Take some of that money and invest it in these low-income group organizations, and you will see them turn. The lowest turnout, voter repression in low-income black communities, in New York, in D.C., for example, the last mayor's election in the high-crime black areas, only 7% of the people voted. All over the country, in low-income black neighborhoods, the voter turnout is less than 10% because people feel they're living in a banana republic, and it has nothing to do with a voter ID or anything else.
Well, so then respond to Republicans who would say, you heard that clip from Eric Adams. Well, yeah, Bob, that's great, and I agree with that in theory, but you got Eric Adams using the billions of dollars he has access to of other people's money in the New York City budget and sprinkling the infield with money that you can't compete with in terms of private sector. Now, maybe that's probably illegitimate, some of what he's doing, and maybe even illegal. But that's what's done. Big cities, will distribute the spoils of war, and they have more spoils of war to distribute. So how do we compete?
It's not a matter of competing with the amount of dollars. You know yourself that there are people who have invested in elections that outspent their opponent and got beaten. Right in California, on this referendum on affirmative action, the pro side spent 10 times the amount of those who were in opposition, and yet they still lost. Mm-hmm. So the amount of money invested in a campaign or the amount of money invested in it is not determined by the amount of money. It's strategic investments among critical grassroots leaders that have influence in these communities that can make a difference. So you don't have to look at it in terms of volume. It's the content of what is supported. So that's a mistake that people are making. Because low-income people understand the charade. They know that having some black person who's administering a program that is failing them, it still fails them.
I wanted to get your reaction to something else, to just this development in the schools, since that's another institution that has all but disintegrated in urban centers like Chicago. This story out of Louisiana, where Republicans there became the first state in the nation to compel government schools to display the Ten Commandments in the classroom. Setting aside for the purposes of our discussion the constitutionality of it, what do you think about that? About sort of the push to remind people and educate young people as to the principles on which this nation was founded, the principles that informed our founding documents?
I just think that certainly what they're trying to do, I understand. But I think we put too much emphasis on symbols. It would be better. Your messenger is as important as a message in situations like this.
Mm-hmm.
Suppose this was done by a group of low-income black parents who said, both historically and currently, the reason that our kids are able to thrive in some of our local Christian schools is because of these values. Hold up an example of people. That's why what we're doing at the Woodson Center is important, because if you want to recruit people to the values of the founders, show them examples of how these principles and these values is the foundation upon which lives are being restored, communities are being rebuilt, people are being redeemed. And that's the importance. We should do a public relations campaign that takes you into low-income communities when you see evidence that these values have the consequence of improving of a whole community of people. That, to me, would be much more effective than holding up the Ten Commandments at a place and demand that this be accepted. That's an important symbol, but it is only a symbol. It's a shallow symbol compared to holding up hundreds of parents who are saying that their children are Pinewood, for instance, the Pinewood Day School, 115-year-old boarding school in Jackson, Mississippi. They only take kids from the most challenged backgrounds, and yet over the past 10 years, every one of those kids have gone on to college. This, to me, is a powerful symbol that the whole country needs to get behind and invest in Pinewood to the point where it can triple its enrollment and becomes a national symbol of how the founding values of this nation have the consequence of transforming and redeeming lives and communities. Dan, this would be much more important than holding up the Ten Commandments.
Good answer. Yeah, that's a good answer. That's a very good way to look at it. Bob Woodson, not surprising, founder and president of the Woodson Center, also founder of 1776 Unite, author of Lessons from the Least of These, the Woodson Principles. Bob, thank you as always.
And thank you for having me.
Thank you. Always a pleasure. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Hear about